Let me just briefly lay out what the format is. We're going to ask Mr. Ritter to speak for 20 minutes, then Professor Ghabra for 20 minutes, then Mr. Ritter will respond for 5 minutes, Professor Ghabra will then counter-respond for 5 minutes, and then we'll move to having our panelists here ask questions, and then we'll move to letting everybody in the audience ask questions. The only request that I'm going to make, besides shutting people off if they go on beyond their allotted time, is that if you have a question, that it be a question. I'm going to ask that no one make a prolonged statement in the guise of a question. Not because you don't have very interesting things to say, but because I think most of us are here to hear Mr. Ritter and Professor Ghabra. And we'll be happy to do some other forum where people from this community perhaps can make their own statements at some length. So I'm going to ask Mr. Ritter to come up here and speak for 20 minutes. Oh, well, there, sorry, okay.
All right, first of all, I want to make sure everybody can hear me fine. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the economic sanctions in Iraq and what they represent, and how maybe we can talk about formulating a policy that leads towards ending the economic sanctions in Iraq without giving up too much in terms of our legitimate national security interests and the national security interests of the Middle East as a whole. Let's define what economic sanctions are to begin with. Economic sanctions were levied on Iraq by the United Nations Security Council in August of 1990 due to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The hope was that these economic sanctions, very stringent sanctions, would compel the government of Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait without the international community having to resort to the use of arms. Unfortunately, the sanctions did not succeed in that effort. And in the first half of, or early part of 1991, the United States, at the head of a coalition of some 30 nations, forcefully evicted Iraq's military from Kuwait, liberating that nation. Now, one would think, having liberated Kuwait, that the justification for the continuation of economic sanctions was therefore finished, that sanctions should be lifted. But sanctions, when they were imposed on Iraq in August of 1990, were really imposed as sort of a reactive measure, a containment measure, trying to contain the problem of Iraq's incursion into Kuwait while the world sought to find a definitive solution. At the end of the Gulf War, at the end of Operation Desert Storm, we still had a problem. The problem wasn't quantified by Iraq's continued occupation of Kuwait. The problem was now quantified by Saddam Hussein's continued existence. The United States had a foreign policy issue with Saddam Hussein as the president of Iraq, and the United States wanted the president of Iraq gone. Unfortunately for the United States, international law and the international community did not share this same concern. So there needed to be a vehicle for which the United States could reach some sort of international consensus on how to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And that vehicle was Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. The United States worked with the Security Council of the United Nations to stipulate that economic sanctions imposed for the invasion of Kuwait would be extended against Iraq, until which time Iraq had been disarmed of its weapons of mass destruction, its nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, and its long-range ballistic missiles. But the purpose of going after Iraq's weapons of mass destruction wasn't the weapons of mass destruction per se. It was to destabilize the regime of Saddam Hussein in hopes that within 6 months or so, he would be gone. So again, economic sanctions continued to contain Saddam Hussein, until which time a vehicle for his removal from power could be found. Unfortunately for the United States, Saddam Hussein simply did not go away. He stayed on, past 6 months, past a year, for several years. But this didn't bother the United States so much because it wasn't, again, we had a vehicle now in place to contain Saddam. That is the continuation of economic sanctions. And these economic sanctions could be continued because Iraq was not fully complying with its disarmament obligation. Iraq was not cooperating with the weapons inspectors to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, the international community continued to put these sanctions in place. This allowed the United States to buy time to come up for a policy to remove Saddam Hussein from power. A succession of CIA-sponsored coups failed. Attempts to create an opposition against Saddam Hussein failed. Saddam Hussein simply was not a problem that was going to roll up and go away. He was there for the duration. So the United States continued to impose a containment policy that has as its centerpiece economic sanctions, the continuation of economic sanctions. Now, you can only continue these economic sanctions within the framework of international law so long as there is a justification. This justification is there if Iraq is not complying with its obligation to disarm. But by 1995, we had a unique situation where the weapons inspectors, for over the course of 5 years, had in fact achieved what we call the qualitative disarmament of Iraq. All of the chemical weapons facilities that were in possession of Iraq in 1991 no longer existed. The same with biological facilities, the same with its nuclear facilities, the same with its ballistic missile facilities. But the method of disarmament was not to the degree that allowed for the ascertaining of 100% disarmament. And Security Council resolutions called for 100% disarmament. So we had this very fuzzy area where weapons inspectors could certify that Iraq was fundamentally disarmed, but under the law, Iraq was not completely disarmed. And the United States took advantage of this fuzzy area to continue economic sanctions. Remember, economic sanctions are not about the disarming of Iraq. Economic sanctions are about the containment of Saddam Hussein, until which time a policy can be found to remove him from power. And unfortunately, that's the situation that we have today. Weapons inspectors are no longer in Iraq. They have been expelled or withdrawn. Iraq has not been certified as being disarmed, even though technically weapons inspectors have found Iraq to be in fundamental compliance. But economic sanctions are still maintained, and they will continue to be maintained until which time the United States can find a way to get rid of Saddam Hussein. There is no correlation between Iraq's disarmament obligation and any efforts by Iraq to comply and the United States commitment to lift economic sanctions. Since 1991, it has been the policy of the United States, and I'll paraphrase, that economic sanctions will be maintained against Iraq regardless of its disarmament obligation, until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power. That is American policy. It does not coincide with the international community's opinion on how we should deal with Iraq. So now the question is, how do we go forward? Clearly, today we have a problem. We have a problem that the economic sanctions that were imposed on Iraq a decade ago have caused tremendous humanitarian harm to the innocent people of Iraq. 22 million people are being held hostage because of the sins of one man. In the United States, through the insistence that economic sanctions will be maintained until Saddam Hussein is gone, has basically created a situation where a sovereign nation, the state of Iraq, has become a refugee camp where its own citizens are refugees, homeless, foodless, helpless inside their own country. This has created a political problem for the United States. Economic sanctions are very difficult to sustain right now. There's a growing recognition in the international community, to include the Middle East, that something has to be done to alleviate the suffering of the people of Iraq. And there's a great call for economic sanctions to be lifted unilaterally. This is not the right course of action to follow. The proper course of action to follow is to fall back on the framework of international law. Under Security Council resolutions, there is a clear linkage between Iraq's disarmament obligation and the lifting of economic sanctions. As a weapons inspector, we not only hunted down Iraq's weaponry inside Iraq, but we also imposed the most stringent, ongoing monitoring and verification system in the history of arms control. What does this mean? Every Iraqi industrial facility capable of being modified for use for the production of weapons of mass destruction was under monitoring by UNSCOM weapons inspectors. Full-time monitoring with cameras, with sensors, with no-notice visits. We certified and guaranteed that Iraq could not reconstitute its weapons of mass destruction capability. That's the most important aspect of the disarmament effort against Iraq, to ensure that having disarmed Iraq, they cannot rebuild these weapons. If you lift economic sanctions and do not get weapons inspectors back into Iraq, there is no longer a check and balance against eventual Iraqi rearmament. And I guarantee you that if we continue to push Iraq the way we are today, to isolate Iraq, to oppress their people, when sanctions collapse, and this is the other risk faced by the United States of America, because we won't allow sanctions to be lifted by the international community, sanctions today are being chipped away, eroded, and they will collapse. And when they collapse, and if there is no checks and balances in place to ensure that Iraq does not reconstitute, Iraq will rearm. And they will rearm with weapons of mass destruction. And a rearmed Iraq will be a resurgent Iraq. And a resurgent Iraq is a threat to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to the entire region. This is the biggest risk. If we continue the current policy that we have today, we are doing nothing more than sowing the seeds for an eventual resumption of military conflict between the United States and Iraq. And this war will not be as simple and will not be as bloodless as the first Gulf War will be. So how do we get out of this problem? There's a lot of talk today about smart sanctions. You hear it's a catchphrase used in Washington, D.C. Smart sanctions reflect the reality that the current program of sanctions is politically unworkable. But no one has defined what smart sanctions will be. But there is one precept that the United States has put forward. Smart sanctions are designed to contain the government of Saddam Hussein. And they will do so by continuing to impose United Nations control over the Iraqi economy. People talk about getting food, people talk about getting medicine into the people of Iraq. The only way you're truly going to liberate the people of Iraq to get that food and medicine is to return control of the economy to the government of Iraq. This will not happen under smart sanctions. Smart sanctions, again, aren't about military sanctions. There's a lot of popular talk about military sanctions. There are no military sanctions. There's economic sanctions. Smart sanctions aren't about getting food and medicine to the people of Iraq. Smart sanctions are simply another way of saying we will economically contain Saddam Hussein. And this is why smart sanctions will not work, because it's a United States policy, a unilateral policy focused on Saddam Hussein, which is a total divergence with the rest of the world. The rest of the world which does not insist on regime removal. The rest of the world which is calling for the lifting of these economic sanctions. What can the United States do? Simple. There's two resolutions in place, Resolution 715 and Resolution 1051. Both have been passed by the Security Council, both were adopted by the Iraqis, and both were successfully implemented for a period of 4 years for 715 and 2 years for 1051 by weapons inspectors. 715 calls for ongoing monitoring and verification, keeping weapons inspectors in Iraq's factories to ensure they do not reconstitute weapons of mass destruction capability. The annexes at the back of 715 run dozens of pages long, and they list materiel that is prohibited to be imported into Iraq. They also list what's called dual-use materiel, which could be converted by Iraq for use in making prohibited weapons, which has to be declared by Iraq to weapons inspectors. This is the smartest sanction you can think of. If the purpose of economic sanctions is to prevent Iraq from reconstituting its weapons of mass destruction capability, then we already have smart sanctions in place. Security Council resolutions, which were fully implemented, which Iraq fully cooperated. For all the non-cooperation Iraq gave me and other inspectors, it was never over the issue of long-term monitoring. It was always over the issue of inspector access to presidential sites and other sensitive sites. Iraq never once failed to cooperate with long-term monitoring. That's the smartest sanction that will achieve what the intent of the Security Council was from the very beginning. Disarming Iraq and putting in place a mechanism to ensure Iraq does not build weapons of mass destruction. Instead, what we have in place are sanctions which target 22 million innocent people, which have killed anywhere from 300,000 to 1.5 million people, and do not touch Saddam Hussein and do nothing to ensure that he will not at some point rearm. I think we're headed in the wrong direction on the sanctions debate, and I certainly look forward to hearing the opinions from the fellow panelist members. Thank you.
Professor Ghabra?
I'm going to go ahead. Well, good afternoon. That's a big crowd over here. And actually, I discovered quite a difference between Seattle and Washington, D.C. The two Washingtons are different in a certain way. You guys are very much laid back and very friendly at the same time. And though you have a Capitol Hill, and though you're both Washington, but they're very much on target. You are on your target in a different way. Even you drive differently, right? You're a little bit dangerous, but still, I was able to survive the cab yesterday. But I'm happy to be here and appreciate this invitation. And let me then try to maybe create some sort of an understanding of a very complicated phenomena and a very complicated situation in the Middle East and over Iraq in particular. Can this be a little bit higher? Yeah, that makes it easier. Very good. Well, being myself someone who personally experienced the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, I then probably may have a different side of looking at it all. Not necessarily very contradictory, but maybe complementary, adds up to the overall scene. But definitely I'm not here to condemn every word said, but at the same time, also I'm not here to condone the sanctions as they are in place today, or to say that they are exactly the right solution to the right problem. So the sanctions are problematic and have contributed to the suffering of the Iraqi people. And Kuwait and many other Arab countries do call for the lifting of much of the sanctions imposed on the Iraqi people. However, we do not call for the lifting of the sanctions imposed on the regime of Saddam Hussein. By no means. And we do that for the following set of reasons. So much of what I want to explain probably will have to do with these reasons. So in this presentation, so-called presentation, I will cover the following points in my 2-hour presentation. I will speak about the record of the Iraqi regime. 2, we'll look at the human rights in Iraq. 3, compare how different Arab leaders have reacted to similar circumstances. 4, causes for the Iraq behavior. 5, the recent Arab summit. And then finally, what's going to look like, going to happen, what's the future holding for us. So in my 20 minutes, and I have someone there keeping me on, keep telling me, let's go over the record. And that tells us of a very unique political system in Iraq. In 1979, Saddam Hussein takes power. Immediately, he has a meeting for much of the Ba'athi leadership in Iraq. A meeting like this meeting. But you are fortunate not to be there, and I'm fortunate not to be there. At the end of the meeting, people are picked up among the leaders of Iraq and taken from a door like this by the security to be executed immediately. He started his regime with a reign of terror. Few months later, he decides to tear on TV the agreement he had with Iran over a disputed territory. He invades Iran, thinking it's a month or 2. It takes 8 years. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed and injured, and it's a catastrophe at the time. Chemical weapons were used by Iraq against Iran. By the end of the war, many of us in Kuwait and in the Gulf felt that that's the end of it. You know, you go in one war and that's it. You want to rebuild, you want a future. And therefore, there was a lot of talk about a lot of work to get Iraq back on its feet. Saudi Arabia decided to forgive Iraq from all the loans, because by the end of the war, Iraq had like $70 billion of debt. It used to have like $35 billion internationally invested. He spent it all on the war. So by the end of the war, that was the feeling in the region, how to help Iraq get out of this. But Iraq got into another conflict with the Kurds, used chemical weapons against the Kurds. Actually, we could be blamed for turning an eye on this, everybody in the world. And yet, hoping that we can still live around Saddam Hussein and manage. But then in 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait. So far, okay, he invades Kuwait, he takes a whole country. I mean, not like a part of a country, but the whole country. And then after that, he decides to take hostages. So he takes all blue-eyed, blonde, colored hostages from European, Western, American citizens who were working in Kuwait and Iraq. And he says these are foreign guests. And that goes on for months. He releases them on Christmas as a Christmas present. Everybody goes to Iraq begging Saddam Hussein to withdraw, including Muhammad Ali Clay, the famous boxer, and including the well-known activist Jesse Jackson, and including many others and leaders. And he says, no, I'm staying on. Annexes Kuwait, starts looting the whole country. And then 30 countries were assembled to fight him. Who in his mind will find 30 countries? He went to war against 30 countries, led by the United States, Britain, France. Several Arab countries were involved against him as well, Egypt, Syria, all the Gulf countries. At the end of this, he burns the oil fields in Kuwait and commits the worst environmental disaster, at least that we know of, after World War II. And goes on declaring victory, commemorating his victory every year and telling us he's coming back. And he's taking everybody. He had an intifada immediately after the liberation of Kuwait in the south and north. He brutally puts it down and goes on, playing a mouse and cat. At the time with Scott Ritter, I was at Kuwait University watching him, going in and out under very difficult circumstances, and with UNESCO, and going around and trying to survive, and at the same time maintaining the position that he had. Well, he still has 600 Kuwaiti POWs. 1 out of 1,000 Kuwaitis is a prisoner today in Iraq, where we have no news of what happened to them. In 1994, he puts troops, he brings about 60, 70,000 troops about 10 miles from the Kuwaiti border, and was ready to invade again. That's in October of 1994. We couldn't believe that was happening until later on Hussein Kamel, his son-in-law, defected and said at the time he was seriously considering going in. So that kept going on. Crisis after crisis, issue after issue, it never stopped. This is the record so far. Let's look at the human rights. It's the only Arab regime with such a record of terrible human rights at that level. There are many Arab regimes with problems with human rights. And you could go read the State Department, you could read any Human Rights Watch, Middle East Watch, you will find a lot of problems. But nobody in the world today has 16,000 from his own people missing inside the country. And they're all documented at the UN, name by name. Men, women, and children, old and young. 16,000. Adding to that, 2,000 were just recently executed in the Abu Ghraib prison. Another 2,500 were executed between 97 and 98. Rape in prisons, threats of Iraqi opposition by videos. I mean, it's fascinating the way it's being, the human rights violations take place in Iraq. It's a republic of fear, as Kanaan Makkiya, the Iraqi well-known thinker and writer whom we never believed before 1990, who now we realize had a story to tell, though his book was published before 1990. But the most revealing incident was when his 2 sons-in-laws defected with his 2 daughters, Hussein Kamel and Saddam Kamel, in 1995. They defected to Jordan. So far, okay, I mean, they defected, no problem. But then he gives a pledge He gives a pledge that nothing will happen. Come back. He promises. They come back. And they are taken. The daughters are taken separately. The two men, his sons-in-laws, are taken to the palace, to where he is, to one of his 80 palaces, spending a lot of money on it. And they're put under a very difficult, they face him. So there is a whole story about this. And then they go to their home. Then the security attack. It's a several-hour battle. Hussein Kamel is killed. His brother is killed. Their father is killed. Their sister is killed. And the son of his sister is killed. So who would kill his two sons-in-laws, create widows out of his two daughters, and orphanages of his grandchildren? And how would you feel being a neighbor of somebody like that? And how would anybody in the region relate to that? Or anybody in the world, actually. So these complications were very revealing overall. And if we go over the human rights record and how Iraqis in Iraq and the 3 million Iraqis outside Iraq feel, one can see that the Iraqi Intifada itself was such a testimony that the regime has no legitimacy. Let's look at how two Arab leaders have behaved differently in similar circumstances. And I'll give an example. You can always blame a lot of things on a lot of people, but let's look at President Nasser of Egypt. We're looking at modern Middle East history, and President Saddam of Iraq. President Nasser of Egypt was defeated in 1967. It's a war against Israel. But what did he do after the war? He accepted Resolution 242, accepted to work with the United Nations. He rebuilt his forces, went into a war of attrition that went on for a couple of years, then accepted an American plan for a ceasefire. Then he opened up his relations with many of the Arab states which his relation was ruptured, which his relation wasn't going well for him before the '67 war, improved his image in the region and his relations with many other governments, mostly Saudi Arabia and much of the Gulf countries. Had a turn in his approach and policy, opened a dialogue with the Americans, kept his relations with the Soviets and the Chinese, opened dialogue with the French and the British, though they were enemies of his in the 50s and early 60s. Had a complete turn, put Sadat as his vice president, and opened Egypt, politically and economically. At least began to open Egypt. Look at Saddam Hussein. None of that has taken place. And it's worse today than it was 10 years ago. Same old things kept coming again and again. What causes his behavior? Well, much of it is in the way he thinks. Much of it is in his own experience. Much of it is the way he has experienced the world. How many times did he travel outside Iraq? Very few. His only international experience was for a few years being in exile after trying to assassinate a president of Iraq in the early 60s and was basically being exiled in Egypt. In addition to that, there is a very complicated situation inside Iraq, where you have Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds, and where you have a very complicated structure in the country, where much of crisis creating and adventurism keep you in power. And therefore, as long as that structure is also there, much of adventurism and crisis creation will take place in Iraq with the region. Even in the recent Arab summit, and how much do I have? 5 more minutes? That's plenty of time. Thank you. Are you getting bored with this? Is this too heavy for you? For me? Okay. Heavy emotionally, maybe, but in the recent Arab summit that took place in Amman, much of the heads of Arab states that came to that summit wanted to help Iraq lift the sanctions. This is a fact of politics in the region, including Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Jordan, King Abdullah in particular. And what was the response of Iraq? They weren't concerned. They made it very hard for everybody who wanted to help them. In the Arab Summit, there was a proposal to call for a lifting of sanctions. But with that proposal, there were other articles, such as Iraq guarantees the security and integrity of Kuwait. Iraq said, no, we will not. Including in that particular statement was one that says Kuwait will never interfere in the internal affairs and would respect the integrity and sovereignty of Iraq. Iraq said, no, we don't need that. Even there was a call that Iraq should have some dialogue with the UN, to get the resolutions moving, like Scott Ritter is saying, to get the long-term monitoring and get the search back and get the United Nations resolutions. The Iraqi delegation said no. Then the Arab leaders said, why don't you get in touch with Saddam Hussein? Because there were representatives, vice president of Iraq was there, and they said, we can't reach him. He's unreachable. So finally, the communique did not come out from the Arab Summit on Iraq. And what many concluded in the Arab world as a result of the Arab Summit, that in fact Iraq is enjoying the sanctions. Saddam is enjoying the sanctions for a very simple reason. It is weakening the Iraqi people. It puts the blame on the UN. It doesn't have any blame on him for economy. But at the same time, if sanctions are at least opening Iraq, lifting those sanctions that directly hurt the Iraqi people and trade and travel, maybe a dynamic would come over there that Saddam cannot control. And that could be the beginning of a Milosevic phenomena that ended up with Yugoslavia without Milosevic. So there was that conclusion in the region, including in Jordan, among King Abdullah, that he doesn't feel comfortable lifting the sanction. The second thing he doesn't want any particular relation with the United Nations and with the Security Council. Even the Russians and French were angered with this and continue to be. And the third thing, he still harbors intentions against Kuwait and trying to destabilize a region that has 60% of the world known oil reserves, and a region that is important to its people, equally important to the world around it. And I have 1 minute. Well, in conclusion, what lies ahead is risky, could be confrontational, and there could be crises coming with Iraq in the coming 6 to 9 months. Yet, I do see changes in the sanctions regime. June could bring about a new proposition for making the whole sanctions regime much more lighter. Yet the escrow account by which Iraq will deposit its money in the French bank controlled by the UN will continue to be applied for the foreseeable future. So what one sees is that the present regime is not easily rehabilitated, is not going to be easily rehabilitated, is irrehabilitated. It's not easy to put him back in a normal setting like other leaders. There is a Milosevic phenomena in Iraq that haunts the situation, complicates the process, and makes a danger of crisis an equally heavy on the people of Iraq and the people of the region as well, and everybody involved in addressing the Iraq file and the future of Iraq as well. Besides that, thank you very much, and we'll continue on the discussion.
Well, I thank Dr. Gabra for that very insightful and emotional discussion about Saddam Hussein. Unfortunately, I don't think we're here to talk about Saddam Hussein. You will find no disagreement from me about the brutality of this madman. This is a very dangerous man, and I think we're in universal agreement. But we're here to talk about economic sanctions. I'm not here to talk about an Iraqi dictator. I'm here to talk about a failure of American foreign policy. For all the sins that Saddam Hussein has committed, and those sins have been many, Economic sanctions and the hardship and suffering they've caused make them pale in comparison. The number of Iraqis killed in the Anfal campaign in the 1980s, 80 to 100,000. Despicable, I agree. The number of Iraqis slaughtered in Saddam Hussein's prison camps last month, 2,000. Despicable, I agree. The number of Iraqis killed directly or indirectly because of economic sanctions imposed since August of 1990, and economic sanctions continued as a cornerpiece of American foreign policy against Iraq, 300,000 to 1.5 million. On a scale of injustice, I would say what's being done in the name of American foreign policy far outweighs the sins committed by a brutal dictator. Furthermore, I fully blame Saddam Hussein for the deaths that have taken place as part of economic sanctions. He has the key for lifting economic sanctions, but he will not do so because with that key for lifting it means turning over his economy to control of the United Nations, an unacceptable requirement. He is guilty of killing his own people, but under any sort of law, when a murderer goes into a bank and pulls the trigger on somebody in the bank, the person driving the getaway car is an accomplice. In the case of Iraqi economic sanctions, while Saddam may be killing his people, it is American foreign policy that enables him to do so, and we therefore are complicit in this crime. And as an American, and this is what everybody in this audience must be focused on, American foreign policy, it's a failure. The policy is not getting rid of Saddam Hussein. Terrible harms are being done to the people of Iraq in the name of this policy, and Saddam Hussein's only getting stronger. So to talk about a continuation of economic sanctions is to talk about continuation of a failed policy. It's time to start looking for a new way forward, and I believe I put some options forward that are lawful, they are moral, and they do have a good chance of success. Success in not only liberating the Iraqi people from the terrible harm that they've suffered in the last decade, but success towards propelling Iraq and the Middle East towards a time where there will be economic stability, where there will be political stability, where Kuwait will not have to worry about Iraqi incursions. But I guarantee you this, continue this policy, and in 3 to 5 years, Iraqi tanks will once again be rolling towards Kuwait City. Iraqi missiles will once again be launched towards Tel Aviv. That is the end result of this failed policy. This is a policy that not only is failing to get rid of Saddam Hussein, address the issue of Saddam Hussein, but it strengthens Saddam Hussein. We must end sanctions, and we must come up with a new way of dealing with Iraq today. Thanks.
Wow, that's getting serious. Well, let me say a few things that I have learned in the past from you, Scott. Because I've always followed your news. In 1998, and in September of 1998, you said Iraq today is not disarmed and remains an ugly threat to its neighbors and to world peace. That was in September 3rd, 1998. Joint Senate Foreign Relations Armed Service Committee hearings. Then you said, I would love to be in Iraq today doing my job of finding those horrible weapons, or in New York supporting the other brave people in the Special Commission who do this task. In 15th of September, 1998, House International Relations Committee. And finally, you said, Iraq is not disarmed. Iraq still possesses a real and meaningful threat to its neighbors, and nothing the Security Council or the United States is currently doing will change this back. And I agree with you on that. But that was also said on September 16, 1998. So, did you really change your mind that quickly? From 1998 to 2001? And how did you change your mind at a time when Iraq has no monitoring whatsoever, where there is no inspection, where as a citizen of Kuwait, and maybe you're supposed to be an expert, you should know that he could produce a lot of things that could harm much of the region around him, as he did in the past, and maybe worse in the future. That the biological can easily be reconstituted, as well as the chemical, while the nuclear, I will agree, is still far away in Iraq. But to make us feel that things are much more less dangerous than they sound is a little bit distracting. At one point, not only the American president, but also many other leaders concerned with what was going on in Iraq listened to the advice of, at the time, several Arab leaders who went to Saddam Hussein and said, Saddam, are you serious about you're going to do something about using military force against Iraq, against Kuwait? Are you serious that you're going to attack Kuwait? He said, absolutely, I'm not attacking, I'm not doing anything. And that was Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, visiting Iraq, getting confirmation that there will be no use of military force few days before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. King Hussein of Jordan also went to Iraq. And they both telephoned President Bush and told him, don't worry, the guy isn't crazy, isn't mad, isn't going to create a foolish act. It's tension, but he's just doing it to get some money, to get some compensation for some, but that's about it. Don't worry. And a few days later, we wake up in Kuwait City, and the Iraqi forces are rolling all over the country. So lifting the sanctions, yes, we are for the lifting of the sanctions, but show me the way. It's not going to happen unilaterally, in the sense that you're not going to come, lift everything, and then expect Saddam to be the next day in several other capitals and threatening much of the region. It has to happen in some way by which Iraq cooperates. And if Iraq does not cooperate, then you're going to end up lifting the sanctions that particularly hurt the Iraqi people, and then call for imposing certain sanctions on the regime. How about allowing every Iraqi to travel and not allowing 30 top Iraqi officials who are involved in war crimes from travel? How about that? How about lifting the sanctions over the Iraqi people, but not lifting sanctions over Iraqi leaders? How about indictment? How about war crimes? How about these things? I mean, why not call for this and this? Let's lift the sanctions, but let's indict. And I think many will go for this. At the same time, even with the sad reality that took place in Libya, where there were sanctions, at one point, Gaddafi came and cooperated and managed a way. This is where you are really facing a very difficult, complex situation with Saddam. You lift them, problematic. You keep them, more problematic. So lift the sanctions over the Iraqi people, but keep the sanctions on the Iraqi regime. And that will mean the escrow account. And that will mean, that is, Saddam will not have money in his hands. That will mean focusing more on the countries around Iraq by not allowing smuggling. So everything goes through the international legal trade that is sanctioned by, accepted, agreed upon by the UN. At the same time, making sure that trade and travel is allowed in Iraq. And I'm being told here that it's over. What is over? Iraq, Saddam. Let's hope Saddam. Thank you.
Well, okay. That quick little exchange means that I suppose you'll answer the questions that were posed a bit later. What I'm going to do, though, is just say, again, reiterate questions, not statements, and the first thing. And the second thing is, I want both panelists and people in the audience to feel that you can either ask specifically about Iraq and the sanctions, but since the students at the Jackson School are engaged in larger issues of U.S. policy. And since I think that for the next couple of generations, U.S. foreign policy isn't going to get any easier to make, if you want to expand your questions into the general areas of how will the U.S. deal with similar kinds of issues, and we could run down a list of places like Rwanda and Cambodia and other places, I certainly would welcome you doing that. So I'm going to now ask Professor Kasaba to begin a brief question period. And we're going to go down, we'll go down, and then we'll go down again.
I'm hoping that this works. Good. It's not surprising, Ellis and I are good friends and we think alike. I have two questions, one to Scott Ritter and one to Dr. Ghabra. And they are questions that have to do with general issues that are facing the U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. The questions, I'll put the questions and I'll explain them very briefly. I don't have a speech prepared. I'm not qualified to go into the details of the situation in Iraq, and there are people on the panel who have first-hand experience and they will be asking informed questions about that. Now the first question to Scott Ritter is this. Is it possible in the 21st century to have a comprehensive vision that would form the basis of U.S. foreign policy in places like the Middle East or in Iraq? Or is U.S. now doomed to manage a situation like that by only focusing on bits and pieces and then ending up with a picture that has many parts that don't quite fit and sometimes that go against each other? What do I mean by this? I mean, when we look at the sanctions regime, as was explained, there were three goals. One was to contain Iraq through disarmament. The second was to weaken and eventually get rid of Saddam Hussein's regime. And the third was part of a more ambitious goal of remaking the Middle East politics. Peace in Israel and Palestine, post-cold alliances, economic cooperation, etc. So when we look at these three goals, we find that after 10 years or so, Iraq has been contained, more or less, but the others, of course, are not really served very well. If anything, it can be argued that Saddam's regime is a lot stronger, and a lot of the other pieces of the Middle East restructuring are not there. In particular here, I have in mind some of the closest allies of the United States, like Turkey and Jordan, who have suffered a lot as a result of the sanctions regime. In the case of Turkey, it is estimated that over $30 billion have been lost since 1990 as a result of this regime. And just to give you an idea, to get out of its recent economic crisis, Turkey needed to borrow $13 billion from the IMF, and that was a make or break proposition. So that obviously is a policy that has really worked against its various components. So that is the first question about the U.S. foreign policy. The question for Dr. Ghabra has to do with something similar in a way. And there I'm wondering, is it possible to carry out a foreign policy that seems to alienate large sections of civil society, both in the Middle East and also in Europe and in the United States? The proof of this, of course, is the fact that we are sitting here on a Friday evening in a hall with over 200 people discussing this issue, and most of the people who are in the audience are students who are about to graduate, some of them, and also people from the community. So is it possible to carry out a foreign policy by ignoring the people that are outside of these governments in the West and also in the Middle East itself? It is not possible. I know, again, the country that I know best is Turkey. It is not an Arab country, but for the public opinion in Turkey, it is not really possible for them to convince that this policy, if it is pursued like this, usually really follows some universal sentiments of human rights or absolute ultimate peace or improvement of human condition in the region. It does seem like a policy that is unjust. It does seem like a policy that is not really thought thoroughly, and what it does is, on the parts of certain people in the Middle East, it serves to sort of inflame anti-Western, anti-US sentiments. So the question is, can we ignore this growing dissent, growing unhappiness on the part of people, and continue to think of foreign policy as something that concerns only states and governments?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I do believe it's possible, and I believe it's imperative that the United States develop strategic vision when it starts talking about foreign policy. I also concur that what appears to have happened in the past decade since the Gulf War is just the opposite. It's very much a reactionary policy where we tend to be dealing with the crisis of the moment. We don't solve problems, we contain problems. When we go back to the end of the Gulf War, there was a vision. There was a vision of the New World Order. There was a hope that somehow Saddam's brutal invasion of Kuwait could somehow compel the world to start cooperating with another through the framework of the United Nations, through a multilateral approach towards problem solving and collective security. And we could engender stability, we could engender peace, we could engender a good economic development, especially in a place like the Middle East. Unfortunately, those were great words, but the actions didn't match them. Instead of seeking a true multilateral approach towards resolving the situation in Iraq, towards reintegrating Iraq back into the Middle East, towards using the disarmament of Iraq as the foundation upon which to build a general disarmament framework in the Middle East to reduce the amount of weapons pouring in the Middle East, to reduce the amount of tension, to reduce proliferation, to engender stability, to engender security, we focused on one man, Saddam Hussein. While the rest of the world was talking about disarming Iraq, we were talking about getting rid of Saddam Hussein. While the rest of the world was talking about the economic rehabilitation of Iraq, we were talking about Saddam Hussein. And that's where the system started to collapse. We may have thought we had a vision, of a greater vision for the Middle East, but we really only had a vision about Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was not reflective of a concern that existed in the world or in the Middle East. It was reflective of a concern that existed in domestic American politics. Having sold Saddam Hussein in the build-up to the Gulf War as the Middle East equivalent of Adolf Hitler, and having allowed Saddam Hussein to remain in power at the end of the Gulf War, we now needed to deal with this. But we couldn't deal with it within the framework of a multilateral approach through the framework of true foreign policy. We dealt with this unilaterally, and that was the demise of our vision. That vision is still a valid vision, and that is the vision upon which I hope the formulators of foreign policy in Washington, D.C. can turn back to once again. And it's a vision that's basically simple. Iraq has been disarmed. Use the disarming of Iraq as a foundation upon which to build a general weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. Is this going to happen overnight? Of course not. But Iraq's disarmament and its certification of disarmament through the reintroduction of weapons inspectors will be the beginning of a process upon which you cannot use Iraq as a vehicle to justify new arms sales to other Middle East countries. When you sell advanced American technology to a Gulf Arab state, all you do is ensure that a nation like Iran will feel threatened, and they will seek their own new weaponry, whether it's new weapons from the Soviet Union or their own indigenous unconventional weapons like long-range missiles and chemical weapons. They will develop it. Selling weapons to the Gulf states does not engender security, it engenders instability. And believe me, a resurgent Iran will only guarantee that Iraq will once again seek these weapons. And this does nothing to address the issue of Israel and its thermonuclear weapons. If Israel feels threatened by a resurgent Iran and a resurgent Iraq, it will never disarm. This is instability. The U.S. needs to start talking about stability. It needs to go back to that vision, but that vision has to be inclusive of a multilateral approach carried out with consensus by many nations. And today, that consensus does not include removing Saddam Hussein from power.
Well, the question you had on Kuwait and foreign policy is definitely a fair question to ask. To what extent is it really a policy that is ignoring many requirements and realities? Well, I will put it this way. I mean, let's look at the recent Arab summit. The foreign minister of Kuwait flew to 5-6 Arab countries and met with leaders and met with presidents and vice presidents and some representatives of the media and civil society. So did the other visitors and other representatives of Kuwait. And the idea was, what are we going to do in the coming Arab Summit conference? That was before the summit. And everybody was shocked by Kuwait coming and saying, we are for calling on lifting the sanctions. The Arab world is not going to, no Arab state has unilaterally lifted the sanctions, because that goes through a whole range of issues related to the UN. But the Arab countries, including Kuwait, are on the record calling for lifting the sanctions. But they're on the record calling for Iraq to have dialogue with the United Nations in order to create an atmosphere of peace in the region. Nothing wrong with that. Kuwait, therefore, with other Arab countries, have come with a great proposal favorable for Iraq. Iraq refused it in the Arab Summit. Now, where would that take us to the next Arab Summit a year later? We don't know. We have to wait and see. But Iraq suffered a big setback due to its policy in the Arab Summit. And civic society and media and the Arab world did react negatively to the arrogance of the Iraqi delegation that had Sahaf, Tariq Aziz, among others, including Izzat Ibrahim. They were in Jordan, hosted by Jordan for the Arab Summit. And the attacks they had against Jordan was unbelievable. During the summit itself, when the speech of Saddam Hussein was read, King Abdullah was surprised to hear insults against his family. And with he's very good in English, he's not as good in Arabic. He wasn't sure whether he really got it that he was insulted. So he looked to his delegation during the speech to check, are we really being? It was fascinating to watch. So one is amazed by how this is going to play, the Iraq policy. And no, Kuwait is on the record for the lifting of sanctions, but is not breaking United Nations regulations or rules as much as neither Egypt is, neither any of them. It all goes through the United Nations. And even Jordan, which lost certain finances, it gained, on the other hand, by the United Nations allowing it to get oil through Iraq and by allowing it to do a lot of business with Iraq. Now, if you get change in the overall situation of sanctions, which I expect will happen probably in June, you're going to have Iraq more open to trade, and you're going to have speedy decisions on all contracts. Neither the Americans nor the British are going to interfere in that, but that's what seems to be. And I think the French are going to buy on this. So will the Russians at one point. So you may end up having a consensus over how to go over this issue. And that's already being talked about, and it has the probability of success soon. So that's my answer to your question. Yeah.
We're just going to move down the aisle here. Press everybody so you guys can ask questions. So,
I have a couple questions for Scott Ritter. I also mentioned that we have at least two things in common, serving in the Marine Corps and also working in civilian United Nations positions. But I'd like to raise some points that are made in the book, Ambassador Richard Butler's book, for Scott, and ask him to respond to those. And the book, I'll also point out that Ambassador Butler's an Australian. I think he would take issue with the argument that UNSCOM, and he was the head of the last inspection regime in Iraq, of which you work for. And I think he'd take issue with the argument that he was an instrument, or that UNSCOM was an instrument of U.S. policy. I think that, and I think Dr. Gabra also made the point that has Iraq disarmed? I think that's one of the fundamental questions here. I think and I think Ambassador Butler in his book paints a very different picture about whether Saddam has complied. And you stated that he had never once was there a failure to cooperate. And I would ask you whether the designation of 100 presidential sites as separate sites not subject to inspection, or whether you determine that to be qualitative disarmament, or whether and the term fundamentally disarmed. And I'm wondering who is deciding fundamental. As I read UN Security Council Resolution 1284, it says cooperate in all respects. And there was also a term in an earlier resolution saying full compliance. So I'm wondering where that term fundamental comes from, or who's going to decide, since we have no inspectors there anymore. And finally, I'd just like to say, you mentioned that the reason that Saddam Hussein is not complying is that if he does, he will be turning over his economy to the United Nations. And I fail to see that in any of the legal structures here. In fact, as I see, once the sanctions are lifted, there's no basis for UN control. Now, there's an interim phase, this oil for food, but I fail to see how, it seems to me that if Saddam complies, then the sanctions are gone, and legally there's no basis for anyone to be running his economy except himself. And my final part of this question, this multiple question, is have you considered that the reason that Saddam is not complying is that he's in fact building weapons of mass destruction?
Thank you very much for these questions. First of all, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to answer indirectly some of the statements made about what I said in September of 1998. First of all, let's understand one thing, that Security Council Resolution 687 calls for 100% disarmament in Iraq, and it's exactly what you say. There is no talk about fundamental disarmament whatsoever. When I resigned as a weapons inspector in August of 1998, I did so because we were not being allowed to do our job by the United States, by the United Nations, and by Iraq to carry out full implementation of Security Council policy. Security Council resolutions calling for Iraq's disarmament. When I testified before the Senate and the House, I testified not as someone who was criticizing overall policy, but as a former weapons inspector who was demanding the right to do his job as set forth by the Security Council. The Security Council, when passing Resolution 687, did so under Chapter 7 of the Charter, which stipulates that Iraq does pose a clear and present risk as long as it possesses weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq is deemed to possess weapons of mass destruction until it is found to be in compliance, and compliance requires 100%. That's what the Security Council tasked us to do. That's what we were trying to do. That's what we were not allowed to do. Therefore, as a weapons inspector arguing to get weapons inspectors back into Iraq to do the job the way the Security Council wanted us to do it, not the way the United States wanted to interpret it, I was very strict. And I said Iraq had not been disarmed. And therefore, to use the Security Council's own words, Iraq represents a clear and present risk to international peace and security, and we must get the inspectors back in. However, it was the United States, not Iraq, that drove a stake through the heart of UNSCOM. It was the United States that used the weapons inspectors in December of 1998 to justify the triggering of unilateral military action by the United States, which was not sanctioned by the Security Council, to use the information gathered by weapons inspectors to target sites in Iraq that had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, but everything to do with Iraq's legitimate national security, to target Saddam Hussein and his inner circle. This is what killed UNSCOM. Was Richard Butler a tool of American policy? When the executive chairman of a United Nations organization meets in secret with the National Security Advisor of the United States and plans in concert the timing of weapons inspections with the timing of military action to achieve a given result of initiating military conflict? Yes, he is a tool of American foreign policy. Furthermore, when the United States undertakes to take that sort of action and destroy a weapons inspectorate that had the honor of the dignity that UNSCOM once possessed when it carried out its work in UNSCOM, it changed the rules. No, 687 never talks about fundamental disarmament, but 687 didn't talk about unilateral military action against Iraq either. And when the United States undertook Operation Desert Fox, it delegitimized 687. One of the reasons why there is a resolution 1284 today, 1284 is the follow-on resolution to 687, brought into force at the end of 1999, is because the international community was in agreement that 687 was no longer an enforceable resolution, that the United Nations Special Commission no longer had the legitimacy or the authority to go back into Iraq, and there must be a new vehicle. Now, what did this new vehicle talk about? It talked about suspending economic sanctions in exchange for getting weapons inspectors back in. But now, is Iraq going to allow weapons inspectors back into its country to run willy-nilly, having just experienced a situation where weapons inspectors gathered intelligence information and passed it on to a member nation who launched a military strike against targets that had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction? Of course not. They will never do this, nor should they. That's why you must talk about, and the only time I started talking about fundamental disarmament is in the post-Desert Fox environment, where I recognized immediately that UNSCOM was dead, that UNSCOM would never go back, and if we want to solve this problem in Iraq, we must come up with a new calculus, a new paradigm, and that new paradigm centers around the issue of fundamental disarmament, qualitative disarmament, because to seek quantitative disarmament means to go back to the tactics used by UNSCOM that were misused by the United States, and there can be no return to that, thanks to the actions of the United States. Presidential palaces? UNSCOM never wanted to go to presidential palaces. First of all, there's not 100 of them, there were 9. These were palaces, the issue of presidential palaces was a political issue created by the United States in concert with Richard Butler to talk about attacking the issue of sensitive sites, denied areas, areas that had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction and everything to do with going after the security apparatus of Saddam Hussein. We were compelled to inspect presidential sites because it became a political issue. And indeed, we did inspect presidential sites. All of these palaces were subjected to inspection by weapons inspectors in accordance with modalities agreed to by Iraq and the United Nations. Did Iraq fail to comply or cooperate with the weapons inspectors? On a daily basis. But they did so usually when we were trying to gain access to a security facility or intelligence facility or a presidential palace looking for documentation that may or may not have existed. Never once did they fail to comply when it was a technical issue dealing with serious disarmament issues. When it came time to destroy their factories, we destroyed their factories. When it came time to destroy their weapons, we destroyed their weapons. When it came time to dismantle dual-use capability, we did this. We monitored them. So therefore, when we're looking for a new paradigm on how to address Iraq and deal with Iraq's disarmament obligation, I would say we need to talk about concepts such as fundamental disarmament, concepts such as qualitative disarmament, and that's why these words came up. No, there is no discussion of this in the original resolution, but the original resolution, frankly speaking, no longer applies. We have to talk about a new way forward, and that's why I use new terminology.
I'd like to thank Scott Ritter for the clarity of his words, and I think a lot of us in the audience share that appreciation. I have no question whatsoever about the statement that Scott made that the United States of America has got a fixation, my word here, with removing Saddam Hussein. That's become the centerpiece of our policy. Scott Ritter said that. I think it's very hard to find question about that. So here's my question. Scott also said Saddam Hussein, has the key for lifting economic sanctions. Now, put those two statements together, and it means that if Saddam Hussein, if Saddam Hussein were to step down from his position as president of the country of Iraq and agree to a successor that would be agreeable to the United States of America, then we would agree to lift economic sanctions. Okay? Now, my fundamental question is any condition whatsoever tied to the lifting of economic sanctions. And I just have this one question, but I do need to give you a little background because a lot of people here will not realize what this is about. In September of 1992, the New England Journal of Medicine issued a report. It said that there were epidemics of waterborne disease, cholera, typhoid, diarrhea, throughout Iraq. That this was because the civilian infrastructure of Iraq had been bombed. Back to the Stone Age was the phrase used during the Gulf War. And that 46,900 children under the age of 5 had died in the first 8 months of 1991. Okay? That means 5,862 children, not children, toddlers and kindergarten age kids, died every month for the first 8 months of 91. Those are the conditions that we created in Iraq at the end of the Gulf War. And then we said we are going to use sanctions conditionally to make demands upon Iraq. Now my question is whether the demands are disarmament of Iraq, whether the demands are the removal of the leader of Iraq, or any other condition. How is it possible to see this reality on the ground, hidden behind phrases such as containment and agreement and such? How is it possible to see this other than the holding of these children as hostages to the demands which we make? And that every time that we make the demands, as everyone that takes hostage, and I don't mean to say that I think that the people who planned this policy initially envisioned it going on longer than, say, half a year. But half a year would be 30,000 children's deaths. Do you realize? That's documented not from Iraqi numbers, but from the New England Journal of Medicine. So my question is, actually, my own view is I don't see any way around that this is just what it seems to be, which is terrorism. But how did we get into this situation? Thank you. Yes, I think that's correct. We need to finally say the words. Yeah. 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 And in relation to Dr. Goldberg's question about the broader New World Order, in our vision of that, it's very clear that there are cases in which we wish to use, and our allies wish to use, and other countries in the world wish to use collective punishment against people. And that's exactly what's been happening in Iraq since 1991. Well, if that is the New World Order, we are in very deep trouble. And that's the reason why I go to Iraq 7 times, why I risk arrest and all of that, because I think that these sanctions, given the nature of what they are doing every day, 150 dead children, need to end unconditionally, and that is entirely in our power as citizens of the United States of America, and we have to end them. So I hope there's a question in that.
I think the question is, what do you think about that? Not more than 3 or 4 minutes apiece, so we can let people in the audience do questions.
All right. Well, it depends which sanctions are we talking about. So, end the sanctions unconditionally, which sanctions? That's the question, on the one hand. The second one.
To rebuild the infrastructure. Yes.
So, basically, to rebuild the infrastructure of Iraq, I think that's coming. To allow for trade in Iraq, that's coming. To allow travel, that's all today being in the pipeline of taking root in the United Nations. Now, lifting unconditionally, that's another matter. Does that mean that there will be no escrow account, that the money being sold from oil will go to Saddam Hussein? Is that what you are trying to get to? And if that happens, how will Saddam use that money? To re-invade neighboring countries or to subjugate the Iraqi people? If you tell me that money will going to be used for the Iraqi people, then that's the role of the United Nations now to do, which is to help finance all the civil society and all the projects that are needed in Iraq openly and clearly and in a speedy process without any delay. There is no guarantee that if you give all this money to Saddam, he's going to spend it on anything but the security. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, I mean, we didn't understand and comprehend these aspects. But I remember talking with Iraqi soldiers. You talk with someone who's in his 30s, who has been drafted to the army when he was 18, to participate in the Iraq-Iran war. Drafted sometime in 1977, 78, before the war. By the time he was ready to leave, after 4 years, 5 years of serving, well, the Iraq-Iran war erupted. And then he's asked to stay and cannot leave. And then, by the time he was ready to leave after the Iraq-Iran war, he was asked again to participate in the occupation of Kuwait and in a war against 30 countries. And once that was over, there was still security. I mean, so you would see someone who's been for 13 years in the army, and 1 million people army. You would see people, drivers taken from the street, put and taken to the Popular Army to occupy Kuwait. So you'd see misery. Iraq came to us. So somehow we became part of Iraq. And for 7 months, Kuwaitis became citizens of Iraq. So we had a taste. And I happened to go to Basra and Baghdad during the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. For my family was held in Baghdad for a while. And I had to go there. They wanted to leave. They were not allowed. They were taken out of aeroplane. That's my wife and 2 children. And talking of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old at the time. And I was amazed in Iraq as I passed in the car to see villages, extremely poor, to see children barefoot in an oil country, in a rich country that had oil, water, agriculture, and everything, and to see the results of what Saddam has done to the Iraqi people since he came to power. Turned the country upside down. So to say that can be all rehabilitated again, lift unconditionally, accept unconditionally, is a framework for disaster, for American policy, for the people of Iraq, and for the people of the region. And let me add one thing. And let me add that the problem with people like Saddam Hussein and with people who try to justify their role and to try to get them off the hook is basically contributing to more violence, to more deaths, to more disasters that are still unforeseen. And if you live under Saddam Hussein's rule, or has been subjugated to his rule, you will have a very strong position against him. If you've been subjugated to his regulations, you will have a position. If you live at far distance, you would look at him and say, oh my God, that's a hero. That's how heroes have to be. It depends how far are you. So let me give you, a very simple example. Many communists in the past would go to the Soviet Union and would be amazed that Soviet citizens were not communists. They would come from America and try to talk Soviet citizens into communism at a time when the Soviets were not interested anymore. The Soviets who were living in the Soviet Union knew the reality of communists. Those who were coming from abroad did not know what was exactly going on for the people inside. If you talk to a Kurd, you will hear a clear answer. If you talk to a Shiite Iraqi, you will hear a good answer. If you talk to many in Iraq, you will hear a strong answer on the situation in Iraq. You will find them all for making their lives better, but they all know at the core of the problem is the leadership of Saddam Hussein, and they are in a prison, they are hostages, and they don't know what to do about it. Thank you.
That concludes our panel section of the evening. So now I see that, I'm sure I'm going to see these hands going up. Why don't you start? You have to stand up, you have to project.
Nobody agrees, I mean, everybody agrees that Saddam's not a good guy. But let's not think about him as being a dictator, a bad guy in all the means. But I was there until 1996. And I never experienced a bad, an unlivable thing in Iraq. Till 1991. Till the sanctions were there. We were in a war for 8 years with Iraq.
Okay, I am going to have to ask you to turn this into a question.
Yes, just I couldn't.
A question directed, no, but,
I'll ask one question.
okay.
He was asking other question if there's overlap.
Right.
But just one thing. We were a family of 10. My father was the only one working as a bus driver. But we all had food, good food. And that's what, as a child, we were concerned about. But after the sanctions, no. I faced everything. And my question is, my niece is 10 years old. She sent me a letter telling me when I'm going to have a good meal again. And can you please forgive us children of Iran for a crime that we didn't do?
Quickly, with all due respect, if you are Kurdish and you are from Kurdistan, the Kurdish territories are in the north, and they have enjoyed autonomy in the last 9 years. There are lots of problems in the Kurdish areas, but now you're not exactly under Saddam now. But I agree that the sanctions are on the Kurdish areas, though the Kurdish government that you have elected, Barzani and Talbani, have been doing much better in addressing a lot of the problems of the Kurdish areas. There is a lot of work in the Kurdish areas to be done. But at the same time, Kurdistan is in danger. And if I would be allowed to predict, and I don't know, I have no answer to your question, because I hope you realize I'm not the one who did the sanctions. Neither do I support the sanctions. Neither do I believe the sanctions should stay. Neither do I know how these sanctions are going to fully go unconditionally, as suggested. All I know, it's a messy situation. It's a complicated situation. But I do see Saddam trying to invade the Kurdish territories, and that the next crisis between Iraq and the world could be over the Kurdish territories, and that could be a very complicated situation. So I really don't know. It's again, complicated, difficult, and there is the Saddam factor to look at, not only everybody else. And I would add, if you allow me for half a minute, is that I don't believe American foreign policy after 1992 sought the removal of Saddam Hussein. I genuinely do not believe so. American policy... did not do that because there were attempts to assassinate Bush in Kuwait, the father. America didn't do anything. He invaded the Kurdish areas and then withdrew later. America didn't do anything. He challenged on many accounts and didn't do anything. So in some ways, the Bush policy, the Clinton policy had many, many problems with it. The question now, will the Bush policy be any different? Could it be any better? Could some of the ideas be formulated in the line that we are talking? That could carry a different situation if it is more serious. The Clinton administration was not as serious on the Iraq issue. Focus on solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, but in a way that ended up creating a collapse in the peace process. And so there were many mistakes done, and we have to admit and see these mistakes.
Okay, I'm going to really insist that we do questions, not statements. Questions from the two main speakers are going to have to be assumed to be rhetorical. They're not actually asking you for answers. Okay? So with that, we have guys with microphones. I'm going to ask you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I've got a question about the use of cluster bombs on the February 16th attack on Iraq by the United States. I'd like the speakers to comment on that, the JSO cluster bombs, and what that might say about the U.S. bombing strategy in Iraq. And also, as part of that, would like you to comment on a report that appeared in the Providence Journal Bulletin.
Question. You've asked a question. I'm going to...
About bombing in Kurdish areas where Turkey's allowed to bomb Iraq and
okay,
bomb Kurds.
Well, I'm not going to get in the position of trying to justify American targeting practice and weaponization. Look, the fact is we are enforcing no-fly zones in northern and southern Iraq, and we're using American military forces, our own fellow men and women, servicemen and women, to do this. And when they're subjected to harm, such as attacks by Iraqi air defenses, they have every right to defend themselves. And if Iraq will illuminate their aircraft with radars, we will use the weapons required to take these radars out. And if that means using cluster bombs, so be it. The point isn't that we're using cluster bombs. The point is, why are we flying over Iraq to begin with? We should not be in a situation where we are compelled to act in self-defense. And I think that's the true crux of the point. Don't get into a question of how we use weapons and why we use weapons. Get into the point in how we employ our military to begin with. Why are we in northern Iraq? Why are we in southern Iraq? And maybe if somebody came up with an answer, we wouldn't be dropping those cluster bombs.
Okay, if you're going to ask questions, you're going to have to line up. I see what we're doing. Right, okay. Line up along the... Sure.
I mean, why are you in Iraq? And why aren't you in Iraq is a very complicated question. But let me say that in Iraq, and after 1991, there was an uprising in the south and in the north. And in that context, there was an American presence in all over the Gulf and all over the region, including Turkey. In 1994, Iraq put its troops on the borders of Kuwait and threatened. That expanded an area called as a no-fly zone. Today, when you look at that whole region, the no-fly zone has become part of that situation in the north and in the south. Now, you could tell me in a new policy, you would reconsider the no-fly zone, maybe make it smaller or make the amount of aeroplanes that are surveilling that area less. But you could have 100,000 from the Republican Guards on the borders of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, threatening one of the most important regions in the world in ours. The no-fly zone has permitted us to have security over there. And that issue has the cooperation of a whole range of states in the region. Now, this could be reviewed, maybe decreased, but it is still vital to the security of the region. As long as there is a political problem, and as long as Saddam is saying, once you give me a chance, guys, I'm going to invade you, you're going to have this issue over there. And this has nothing to do with the sanctions. The sanctions is a separate issue. The other one is a security issue that is vital, that continues to be vital, will continue to be vital until the political problem is addressed. And Iraq does demonstrate peaceful intentions towards its neighbors.
Okay, I'm going to...
As a democratic socialist, I'm in a group called the Freedom Socialist Party. I am not a supporter of Saddam Hussein, so don't put me in that bag. But I had a question for Scott Ritter, because the position that you're coming from is one assuming that the U.S. is in a position of moral superiority in relation to Iraq. And since we've invaded more countries than any other country in the world, maybe all the rest combined, especially democratic countries, how can we say that we have the right, or the UN either, how can any country have the right to control another country's economy, military, government, whether or not they can fly over their own country, because we want
Okay. Scott.
Wow, gosh, I'm a horrible communicator if that's what I've communicated here tonight. Actually, I think I've tried to communicate the exact opposite of everything you said, except for one thing. We are morally superior to Saddam Hussein. We are the United States of America, and we do come to the table with a certain moral position that should prohibit us from carrying out the kind of policy we are carrying out in Iraq today. One of the reasons why this policy is so vile to me, as an American who served in the Gulf War, as an American who helped participate in the disarmament of Iraq, is that this is an immoral policy. It's not what I stand for as an American. It's not what I went to war to fight about. So I agree with you. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be seeking policy alternatives. We shouldn't be trying to take control of Iraq's economy. We should be trying to work within the framework of a multilateral approach to solving this problem, and that's through the United Nations. That is what gives us the kind of moral position. If the world body agrees to this, if the world body comes up with a solution, and the United States is a full participant in that, we might in fact come up. But as long as we're trying to unilaterally impose our will outside that framework, it's only going to lead to failure.
I think we all agree that Saddam Hussein is a madman. My question is, at what point, and in particular, at what year, did Saddam Hussein become a madman? And what I mean by that is, it's my understanding, I'd like a little bit of history here. It's my understanding that the CIA helped bring Saddam Hussein to power with the coup in 1979. It's my understanding that the U.S. funded Iraq throughout the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s.
Okay.
He wasn't a madman before then, but 1990, 1991, he's now a madman. Can we please explain the contradiction that seems quite apparent to me?
Okay.
You know, when did you know that the mad cow disease began? Only when you saw a mad cow. So by the same token, when did you know that Hitler was mad? Only when he invaded some of his neighbors. And even by then, you thought he was sound. And it took much longer to decide to confront him. So in human history and in relations between countries, it takes a longer time to decide that someone is that really mad in your definition.
How about in 1988 when
Well, no, we're not going to do the back and forth.
By the
You're going to
same
have to get
token,
up
yes.
and ask a question. I'm going to turn over to this side now. And my friendly assistants will keep hold of the mics.
Oh, cool, okay. Well, I came in here to hear some of you on discussion and listen to about the sanction, about the Iraqi sanction and the suffering of the Iraqi people. I think Scott did a good job, salute for that, when he talked about the sanction rather than concentrating on Saddam. In contradiction to that, the Kuwaiti representative, I believe most of his speech was talking about Saddam and how bad. The audience, I don't believe that, unaware of Saddam and how bad and how mad it is. And I just want to say that Iraq is not Saddam. Iraq is cradle of civilization. Saddam will go, so I will lead the question. I know
Is there going to be a
ask
question here?
I know. So I want to ask the Kuwaiti representative why he failed to mention the death, the daily death of the Iraqi people and the suffering for the past 10 years in his speech. He's going to go around the whole United States and give that speech. It will be beneficiary to him because I don't believe the US people are unaware of Saddam. So why did you fail to talk about the people in Iraq? You guys, the one who helped Saddam.
That's a good question. Now we're going to... Okay. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. And so why? I did say that the sanctions are hurting the Iraqi people. But let me tell you, much of what was going on over the last 10 years was also complicated with fighting, crises, attacks, counterattacks, problems. We didn't have a break. The Iraqi people were victims. Iraq is much more definitely than Saddam Hussein, and the Iraqi people are one of the most advanced in the Arab world. And they are so unlucky to have this kind of a regime. However, if you're asking me personally, I was never for Saddam, even during the Iraq-Iran war. And personally, I never wrote a word in his support during the Iran-Iraq war. That's for your own information, speaking about myself as a scholar. Now, talking about Kuwait, about my country, let me say the following. It's a small country. We really were in a very difficult situation related in the relationship to Saddam at the time. Iran, at the time, was in the height of the revolution and was talking about exporting the revolution. Iraq began the war without consulting Kuwait, neither consulting Saudi Arabia, by the way, and began the war without anybody telling him, go do this war. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and much of the Gulf countries are so conservative about starting a war to the maximum. And what happened? There was fear. Iraq invaded. Then we were stuck. The Iranians were almost around Basra. We were forced to stand in support of making sure that Basra is not taken over by the Iranians. Once that war was over, we wished there would have been some sort of a peace. Iraq felt too strong, too victorious, too capable. Somehow we ended up feeding into something that ate us all and put us in the mess that we're in now. So yes, there were all these issues and problems. But I mean, look at Iran today. Iran is tried to even have a good relation with Saddam and tried to have dialogue with Saddam. And look what's happening between Iran and Iraq. Just a few days ago, the Iranians sent rockets to Iraq. And why did they do that? All these clashes and problems. Today, the Iranians are trying some sort of a channel of dialogue through the particularly Iraqi opposition that is stationed inside Iran, led by Al-Hakim, to have some sort of a dialogue with the American administration on what's going to be the next step in that context. Iran could be a very important player on determining what's going to happen in the future of Iraq. So that's my answer. And it's still a very complicated situation as we can relate to.
Yeah. I'm from Kuwait, and it's really flattering to give the idea that Kuwait is so powerful as it has the upper hand or the word to remove the sanction or keep the sanction. This is very nice to hear. Kuwait can't even govern its own air space. But anyway, my question is, and another comment is just a short comment. Yes, I know. It's, for most of you, for all of you who came to know the suffering of the Iraqi people and felt love for Iraqi people for the past 2, 3, 4, 10 years, we've been there centuries ago. We feel we have blood relations with the Iraqis. My grandfather came from Iraq. So nothing you'll ever say can ever, have any more heavier effect on a Kuwaiti than what he already knows. My question is to Dr. Ritter. How would you answer the idea? How would you answer the idea that Iraq itself, or the Iraqi regime itself, not Iraq itself, doesn't favor the removal of the sanction? Because if the people are in a good state and have a good well-being, then they'll turn to fix the other things that is wrong with their regime. You know, as I know, that the escort account it has over $40 billion, and you know about the stories of how they give a long list with like 150 items to import, and one suspicious item, when it gets crossed away, they delete or cancel the whole list and leave their people in famine. So, and recently, like 4 or 5 months ago, Iraq gave of that money, that oil for food money, they gave $200 million for the poor of America. Where are the poor of Iraq? No one said anything about this in the American media. They gave out of the 14 billion. Okay.
Right. Well, again, I think I tried to make it clear in my opening remarks that Saddam Hussein is to blame for the suffering of the Iraqi people, and that Saddam Hussein holds the key to solving this problem. But the fact remains that Saddam Hussein, one of the ironies of our policy of containing Iraq through continuation of economic sanctions is that we think we're targeting Saddam, we're weakening Saddam, we're undermining Saddam. But the exact opposite is taking place. Saddam Hussein is stronger today than he has been at any time since the end of the Gulf War. And the main reason why he is able to parlay the suffering of the Iraqi people for his own political gain, both inside Iraq and outside Iraq. Just a couple weeks ago in an interview with Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, who despises Saddam Hussein openly, Hosni Mubarak said, I can't speak a bad word about Saddam. Why? Because Saddam Hussein is the only Arab leader speaking out in support of the Palestinian people. Saddam Hussein's the only one who said, I'm going to give money to the Palestinians. Empty promises. Empty promises. Saddam can never deliver on them. But because of economic sanctions, Saddam Hussein is able to manipulate the sincere feelings that everybody in this room, I believe, have about the suffering of the Iraqi people for his own good. Does Saddam want sanctions lifted? Yes, under his conditions. Under his conditions. That's why Saddam will never approve and never allow his Russian or Chinese allies in the Security Council to approve any partial lifting of sanctions where you allow humanitarian goods to go in but keep Iraq's economy held prisoner to a UN trust account in Paris. That is not a sustainable policy. What's the best way to threaten Saddam Hussein? Lift economic sanctions. If you lift economic sanctions, he will no longer be able to parlay the suffering of the Iraqi people for his own domestic good or his own foreign policy good. Furthermore, he'll be compelled to act upon his continued promises to deliver a better life to the Iraqi people. And this is a nation that has $200 billion in debt and another $100 billion in infrastructure development that's required. Iraq pumps $20 to $30 billion worth of oil a year. You can see the Iraqi economy is not going to turn up overnight and start pumping out weapons of mass destruction. Saddam has a long road to hoe, and I tell you, you lift sanctions, he must deliver. If he doesn't deliver, then we truly have empowered the Iraqi people for the first time to take the matter in their own hands and get rid of that madman.
And with that, our time has come to a close. I want to, before we all though leave or go anywhere, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank both Scott Ritter and Dr. Shafeeq Ghabra for coming here. I think they've both helped illuminate the problems of this, and I'm extremely happy to have had both of you here for us on the same program. Perhaps we could give them both a round of applause. And our panelists. And lastly, besides the panelists, I also want to thank the students from the Jackson School who really put this all together. So thank you.